start, I do want to give credit to a few people whose work informed and inspired tonight's presentation. First, to Rhonda Spencer, who painstakingly wrote a source book about the art of Lottie Wilson. I also borrowed from Dr. Cynthia Hawkins, whose dissertation, African American Agency and the Art Object, 1868 to 1917, prominently features Lottie Wilson. To Molly Kruk Watson for her thorough research and nomination of Lottie to the Michigan Women's Hall of Fame, and to the Finley family of Niles, who claim Lottie as their own. Thank you for your generations of family history you've shared over the years. So let's get started. Let's talk about Lottie's parents first. Her father was Calvin F. Wilson. He was born in Virginia and moved to Ohio and then to Niles, first to the Howard Township area in 1846. He married Henrietta Hill in 1853, moved to California for a short time, trying to get in on the gold rush, but returned to Niles soon afterwards. Their daughter, Charlotte, known as Lottie, was born in 1854. So Calvin Wilson, from this little clipping in the newspaper, worked as a tonsorial artist. Anyone know tonsorial artist? Barber. Yes, that's a barber, okay? And he had at least 2 different shops in the city. There's character descriptions of him that we find throughout the paper that note him as an honorable citizen, and we'll talk more about his community involvement in a few little slides here. So in 1874, his barber shop was located at 81 2nd Street, just north of Main Street. Here's an ad for his shop. You can see he's barber and hairdresser. Around 1896, he'd relocated to the basement of a building which still stands at Main and 3rd Streets. The building was a post office in the late 1890s and is now a Masonic Hall. It's 227 East Main Street is the address. His barbershop served both black and white customers, and he was respected in both communities. We're going to see when Lottie Wilson is married that she has people of both races attending her marriage celebration. So Mr. Wilson was also dedicated to the African American community at large, as demonstrated in 1867 when, as chairman of the Colored Citizens of Niles, he advocated for the construction of a new school building for students of color. Ferry Street School was built thanks to his efforts. He also served as secretary to the Prince Hall Masons Harrison Lodge in Niles, which is a lodge for African Americans, and he was actually elected Berrien County coroner in 1883, and I believe that's the first time a person of color was elected to a county position. Less is known about Henrietta, as is often the case with women. We have a census card for her in 1900. We know she was born also in 1836, also in Ohio. And we know through various tracings in the newspapers that she remained close to her daughter Lottie throughout her life. Henrietta died in 1905, and her obituary states, Mrs. Wilson was a highly respected citizen and was known for many acts of kindness and charity. She'd been an advocate of religion for the past 50 years. So here's Lottie. She's born in 1854. We don't know much about her childhood. We know that around the age of 17 or 18, she attended the School of the Art Institute in Chicago, probably the first African American to do so. It's not really known whether or not she graduated, if the courses of study even offered graduation or certificate program during that time, but we know she probably attended school on more than one occasion. So this is an issue, this is a clipping here from 1903, noting that she is a graduate of the Chicago Art School, and noting another time that she's been attending art school when she's making her home in Bay City later on. So we know she probably went more than once, and her art career is pretty wide and varied. She worked in a variety of media. She was primarily a portrait and landscape painter, but she also dabbled in painting china, needlework, and sculpting. She also, as is often the case with artists, she taught and she organized art exhibitions and offered a variety of instructions for different students. So she married James Huggart when she was 18 years old, variously spelled either with a T or a D at the end. And then this is her marriage notice in the paper. It's being noted as being attended by white friends. So again, that kind of going between different communities. Her marriage to James produced a daughter, Caletta, known as Callie, who was born in 1874. One of her paintings which survives, which is in the middle here you can see, is of Callie. Sadly, Callie died in 1885 at the age of 10 or 11. While she was married to James, she had 1 or 2 other children who died in infancy. This is her grave marker that you can see on the screen there, and it notes the names. It has Caletta's name, and then there are also the names Dennis and Daisy next to each other, noting birth-death dates of July 22nd to September 3rd, 1876. So it's not clear if Dennis, Daisy is one person or if she had twins who died together. The 1910 census does indicate that she had 3 children, none of them still living. So it's likely that they were twins of some sort. And then the death of Callie obviously stayed with her. You can see the portrait of her on the right. She's wearing a miniature of Callie, as she's often seen here. The marriage with James didn't last. They separated, and in some places you'll read that it's because he died, but looking a little bit further, he actually died later in 1903 in South Bend. We can trace him through the papers. Not one to let her grief take hold, she focused on her art, and this is when she actively began campaigning for women's rights. She held talks at churches and art studios, and this is something she's going to do throughout her career. She does remarry to John B. Jackson in 1885 and moved to Bay City, Michigan. And this is again where she really starts her activism. So I just want to make a quick note that because she's married to Mr. Jackson in Bay City, she's sometimes known, and you can see her in the papers, Lottie Jackson. However, she eventually divorced Jackson, and she always signed her works Lottie Wilson with her maiden name, so that's how I'm going to refer to her throughout. So Lottie was in the circles of some important people like Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington was an influential author and activist. He was the first leader of the new Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, now Tuskegee University. So we know that through the papers, she painted a portrait of Booker Washington for the new Tuskegee Institute, which was presented in 1894. This is often called her first work of significance. This painting, unfortunately, is lost. Washington is also, it's worth noting that he's a friend of Theodore Roosevelt, who's going to come into play in Lottie's life later. Booker was the first African-American man to dine at the White House on equal terms with the president. He was invited. So Lottie's going to continue to stay close to the Washingtons, both Mr. and Mrs. Washington, who you see on the screen there. And at the 1901 National Association of Colored Women, Mrs. Booker T. Washington thanks Lottie for, quote, the magnificent exhibit displayed during the convention. So she's curating art for this convention to advocate for rights, and we'll talk more about this too, because that's going to be a theme throughout her life. Also in her circles were Mr. and Mrs. W.E.B. Du Bois. So he was a prolific African-American writer who earned a PhD from Harvard, and he was one of the founders of the NAACP. Lottie is mentioned with his wife Nina at a meeting of the Women's Improvement Club in Indianapolis in 1904. The article notes, the Women's Improvement Club had for guests Mrs. W.E.B. Du Bois and Mrs. Lottie Wilson, the artist. So those are the only 2 mentioned out of this whole group. That kind of tells you how high up she is in some of these circles. And it's worth noting, if you're studying this period of time, Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois had very kind of conflicting ways for achieving equality and advocating for rights. Same goal, different ideas of how to get there, so there's some conflict there. Lottie kind of stayed in the middle of that and worked with both of them. All right, let's look at some of Lottie's work. So kind of going way back in time, and this is where I need to credit Rhonda Spencer, because she searched newspapers for mentions of some of these works and didn't manage to find too many of them, but mentions of them, and in a few cases, as you're going to see, photographic evidence of them, and maybe they'll turn up someday. So the first one we're going to talk about is Crispus Attucks. You might remember from your elementary school history books. He is a man often described of mixed African and Native ancestry, and he was killed during the Boston Massacre in 1770, maybe the first, so that's kind of, sometimes he's mentioned as the first. So this is, the painting is gone, but there's a photo of this. It's an illustration, actually. I take that back, not a painting. And it's seen here on the cover of a journal from 1951. And if you look at the picture here, okay, this is a picture of the illustration, so not the actual one, but this is Lottie's signature here. Okay, so again, the illustration's gone. Paper is very hard to keep, but there is that photograph of it. And we do know that work was presented at a 1904 reception for the Crispus Attucks Relief Association of Washington, D.C. And in that same article, it's noted that Wilson was an artist of worldwide fame. There's various notes about she was not at that reception, and either she wasn't invited, one newspaper claimed that, but there's also some thought that she might have been traveling in Europe at the time. So she was invited to travel abroad, as a lot of artists did. It's not clear whether or not she actually went abroad, but the timing would have worked out for that. Okay, something a little different, one of her still lifes. This is a work called Nobody's Darling. And it's an old violin. You can see this is a picture of it here in this journal. It's an old violin and some sheet music. And this photo exists in a volume of the magazine, The Colored American, this is the cover of it that you can see. And there's a nice little profile of Lottie and a physical and character description, which is the only one that we really have. She is described as having a picturesque little body. Her delicacy, personal charm, a certain graceful appeal would lead one to believe her weak and vacillating, the kind of woman who needs caresses and protection. But this effect is deceptive and covers firm and quick decision, the ability to observe accurately and minutely, and the will and power to translate impressions confidently. In her work, Mrs. Wilson has imitated no master. She has been guided only by herself, her alert artistic conscience. So again, quite a compliment that we have. So in addition, you've seen this picture before now of her with wearing her miniature of Callie. Medallions and miniatures were another one of her specialties. She had an entire show of her miniature work, and she even wrote an article on the value of miniatures, extolling the warm qualities of ivory. Through art classes she taught, it's noted she makes a specialty of ivory and porcelain work. She wore the medallion of Caletta, as mentioned earlier, and she also presented a medallion of Phyllis Wheatley to First Lady Mrs. Theodore Roosevelt, who's seen on the right. So just a little bit about Phyllis Wheatley. She was an 18th century poet. She's considered the first African-American poet. She published her poetry, and in the middle is an illustration of her from her book of poems. There's another Lottie Wilson connection with Phyllis Wheatley. In Detroit in 1899, there was a home for aged colored women established called the Phyllis Wheatley Home, and Lottie was on the board of this institution. Some of Lottie's medallions were actually copyrighted, and we have those records too, and placed on the market, which means she was sort of mass producing them for sale. And it's noted that there was quite a demand for the medallions of Phyllis Wheatley, and then also another one that she produced of Dr. F.J. Grimke, who was a prominent minister and another co-founder of the NAACP. So that same article that is from earlier offers a description of the portrait medallion Lottie created of Wheatley, describing it as, in the faithful portrayal of the Negro character and complexion she has few equals. The fine modeling and rich, delicate blending of yellow and brown are strikingly realistic. So from here, we'll take a little bit of a look at more of her activism, which is always intertwined with her art because it leads to her connections with Frederick Douglass. So this is in the 1890s. Lots of advocacy groups are forming after the abolition of slavery. African American men are granted the right to vote, not women. No, women can still vote. And things like Jim Crow were starting to happen where rights were being pulled back. And so it was becoming ever more clear that the constitutional amendments weren't enough. There was still a fight ahead. There was a need for advocacy and activism. Several groups joined together in the 1890s, and Lottie was a part of them. In 1896, she spoke at the first annual convention of the League of Colored Women in Washington, D.C. So she's traveling now. She's taking her activism on the road. So this league later merges into the National Association of Colored Women, and Lottie served as art superintendent for the group. So art superintendent, why do you need an art superintendent for an advocacy group? Okay, so we're going to talk about that too. Remember all these people that she's painting. So in 1898, she gave a speech at the Michigan Equal Suffrage Association convention. They held their annual meeting in Bay City. And remember, she has ties to Bay City. She lived there for a time after her second marriage. The MESA, the Michigan Equal Suffrage Association, became the League of Women Voters, which is still around today. So we know of her work with this organization through newspaper clippings again, and also the NACW, the National Association of Colored Women. Lots of alphabet soup and initials here to sort out. So, and they just get more complicated. So the photo on the left is the NACW banner with their motto, "Lifting as we climb." That still exists. So they also, as part of their advocacy effort, they organized what they called the Pan-American Exposition in Buffalo, New York, where they had their annual meeting. Lottie was in charge of their art exhibit. So Pan-American is beyond just America, right? This is global now, somewhat. She's featured in a Buffalo Times article here as a prominent woman of the Colored Congress of this group. So this is Lottie here, the president. This is Mary Church Terrell, if you're familiar with this name, Mrs. Booker T. Washington, and Lottie. So in 1899, the National American Women's Suffrage Association, this is the big one, this is Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, okay? They have their convention in Grand Rapids. This is the only time they ever held their meeting in Michigan. Why is this a big deal? Because other conventions held in the South did not even permit black women to attend. Lottie was a delegate, and likely one of the only African American women in attendance. So you can see here, this is from the Library of Congress. This is some of their minutes. This is a delegate ribbon, not Lottie's, somebody's delegate ribbon. And then here are these two. Here's Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. So Lottie got the floor, and as a delegate, she introduced a resolution speaking out against separate coach laws, which were being reintroduced in the South, which is important also because the association is traveling, right? They want to get women's rights. They need to travel, and they need safety while they do this. So her resolution read, "The colored women ought not to be compelled to ride in smoking cars, and that suitable accommodation should be provided for them." Okay, so when you have to go in a smoking car, you're a woman by yourself, that's dangerous. So she's trying to provide safety for them. Okay. Unfortunately, the resolution was met with little support and even outrage from Southerners. So here's an account of it. Kentucky suffragist Laura Clay took it as an insult against Southern suffragists and dismissed the resolution as irrelevant to the cause and therefore inappropriate. There was a delegate, Alice Stone Blackwell, came to Jackson's defense. Jackson is Lottie at this time, Mrs. Jackson. But it was the opinion of Susan B. Anthony that prevailed in the end, declaring the issue of separate smoking cars beyond the power of women as the helpless, disenfranchised class to change. Anthony ended the discussion. The resolution was tabled as outside the province of the convention. She's going to have better luck next year at the NACW. Later that same year, 1899, so they have their second annual convention in Chicago. Lottie brings up the same resolution, and she specifically mentioned the attitude of Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Here's an article about it. No support there. This organization is going to pass the resolution, and this is a reading. This is the actual note from her, from the minutes here. You can see the name there. Separate coach law. So in 1896, we start seeing her name connected with the Douglasses. She spoke at the first convention of the National Federation of Afro-American Women in DC, and she spoke about Anna Murray Douglass. Anna was the first wife of Frederick. Born in 1813, she married Frederick in 1838 and died in 1882. Together, they had 5 children. So Anna was a part of Boston's anti-slavery society, but she was much quieter than Douglass, though she did support the family through all of his work. At the convention, so this is after Anna's death, Lottie she spoke about Anna Douglass. She gave a speech praising her character and crediting her with much of her husband's success. So the newspaper notes Mrs. Lottie W. Jackson of Bay City was introduced and read extracts from a paper entitled Anna Murray Douglass. We also know that she painted Anna's portrait. It's noted on exhibit in 1904 in Indianapolis, and then in Atlanta, and possibly Nashville. Possibly also Grand Rapids. So this painting moved around a lot, and it's lost today. When it was on show in Grand Rapids, Wilson is described as an artist of national reputation, and it's mentioned a few times as being the only painting of Anna in existence. So even though this painting is lost, I believe that we have a photo of it. So let me explain here. So on the left here, this is a drawing of Anna Douglass by the artist O.W. Brooks from 1922, and it's in the collections of the National Park Service. It was donated by her granddaughters in 1922. So you can note that she's wearing a miniature here, and it's rectangular. The second 2 images are from the Douglass family papers. My mother, as I remember her, one of Anna's daughters was Rosetta Douglass Sprague. And here, she's wearing a circular brooch. Okay, and here, this is a drawing from the same set of papers. So could this image be from Lottie's painting? Could it be an image of Lottie's painting? So no way to know for sure. Why did the brooch change? We also know it's interesting to note that Lottie worked in miniatures and brooches. So did it change over time? I don't know. So also, she was in touch with Rosetta, Lottie was. Rosetta was a founding member of the National Association for Colored Women, which Lottie was the superintendent of and very active of, so they knew each other, the family. So here's Frederick, no doubt one of the biggest names in abolition and the fight for equality. So I hope you have a chance to look through the exhibit and this evening to learn about him. We know one of his most famous things is he said, his greatest weapon was the pen. So he published the anti-slavery newspaper, the North Star. Here's a clipping of it. We know she painted an oil painting of him also. It's mentioned that it was on exhibit in 1903, described as striking, very clever, and reflects great credit upon the artist. There is a painting of Frederick Douglass as a young man in the National Portrait Gallery labeled Artist Unknown. This is it. It came from the estate of Alphonso Janes of the Rhode Island Anti-Slavery Society. Who painted this painting? Don't know. So, but we're asking. So the painting she painted of Frederick Douglass, we know that it was on display during the Lincoln Jubilee, which was an event held in Chicago in 1915 to celebrate the 50th anniversary of emancipation. So the event showcased accomplishments of African Americans, and there was a large art display as part of it. So this photo, there was a publication produced called the Michigan Manual of Freedmen's Progress, and this is a photo of one corner of the Michigan Art Gallery. So you can see there's a photo of Frederick Douglass here. At least we think that's Frederick Douglass as an older man. So it doesn't look like the other one. Did Lottie do this one? Don't know. There's also, we're going to talk about this painting here, okay? Is that Lottie's? I don't know. There's no way to tell. So presumably, these are two very popular subjects, and there would have been more than one painting on these popular people. So, but it's a little interesting tie. None of these paintings are labeled, so further research required. The interesting thing, though, is that that was held in 1915. Lottie died in 1914, so she died a year before that event took place. But there's an article from the Niles papers from the Daily Sun that note Mrs. J.C. Nelson has returned from Chicago, where she'd been attending the Lincoln Jubilee. And she was in charge of the exhibit of a hand-painted portrait of Fred Douglass, the work of a Miss Lottie Wilson Moss. She's going to remarry again, who's now deceased. So there was a lady, it was probably Sarah Nelson, who lived in Niles and died in 1928, who took that painting from Niles to Chicago that we can't find now. So there's also mention in the papers of a sculpted bust of Douglass. There was a bust that she created of him and one of Phyllis Wheatley, who we talked about earlier, and they're mentioned in a 1904 article as plaster casts, the work of Lottie Wilson, have a conspicuous place in the new Carnegie Library. This is in Indianapolis, where she also lived for a time, which was recently dedicated. Okay. There's also a description of a Douglass bas-relief cast, a three-quarter view of the face, slightly turned to the left. So bas-relief is an art term, and it's a sculpted piece with low depth or height. So it's not a full sculpture, something like what you would see on a coin or a medallion. That's not a flat painting, but it's raised slightly. It's noted that she has a copyright for that bas-relief, and there was a demand, so presumably several were made. So neither of the works on the screen are Lottie's again, but just examples to show maybe what they would have looked like. So on the left, this is a bust that you can buy at the Smithsonian store. You can buy it online. Came up right away. And on the right is a coin of Frederick Douglass from the collections of the New York Public Library, made for the 1896 Tennessee Centennial Exposition in Nashville. So maybe around the time that, you know, Lottie was doing a lot of her activism and a lot of her work. Okay, so her best known painting is President Lincoln with a former slave, and it's here, it's on display here, we have it. And this painting depicts the historic 1864 meeting between President Lincoln and the formerly enslaved woman turned activist Sojourner Truth. Sojourner Truth is another fascinating character. She was born into slavery, her name was Isabella Baumfree. She escaped as a young adult and spent her life advocating for the abolition of slavery and then for equal rights for people of color and especially women. Okay. Fun fact about her, she spoke in Niles in 1873 at the New School at Ferry Street. We have it in the paper. So we know that Sojourner Truth had an audience with President Lincoln. The Bible that you see in the picture was presented to him by the, quote, colored people of Baltimore on the occasion of his second inauguration. Lincoln was called a great admirer of Sojourner Truth, and he showed the Bible to her during an 1864 visit to the White House. So Lottie's painting is done after an original by another artist named Frank Corder called Freedman's Progress, and that painting was destroyed in a fire. A photographer named Frank Perry had taken photos of Corder's work, and from these, Lottie recreated it. So everybody knows too, like this is the kind of the amazing thing. Here's the connection. She was invited to present this piece to President Theodore Roosevelt at the White House on May 8th, 1902. According to newspaper reports, Roosevelt greatly accepted the gift, paying a high compliment to the subject which inspired it and to the skill of the artist. The painting then hung in the White House for a time, making her one of the first black artists to have work displayed in this prestigious building. So a photo of her painting was also found on the August 1915 cover of the NAACP's magazine called The Crisis. And this article features, or this edition features an article on women's suffrage by Reverend Frances Grimke, who she made medallions and miniatures of also. This particular magazine was published from 1910 to 1922. Its editor, W.E.B. Du Bois. So just a little side note, I'm going to go back to the painting for just a minute. How'd the painting get to Niles? That's a really fun and long story. I can go into it. It was shown in the White House, then it kind of disappeared. For a while it was in storage, it was rumored to be here, nobody really knows. Maybe it went to Chicago for the Lincoln Jubilee, I don't know, because then it ended up ultimately in Washington again. In 1982, it kind of resurfaced, and it was sold to an art conservator. And this art conservator restored it, found Lottie Wilson's name on it, and contacted Niles, Michigan, the library. Thanks to the research of Alice Finley Brown, who was a Niles relative of Wilson's, the story resurfaced. She knew all about it. And it was sold back to the Niles Public Library today, the Niles District Library, and home it came. All right, so her life in DC. She travels around a lot. She lived in DC in 1901, and she had an art studio on M Street. It's noted in the papers that she made many friends in the city while attending the National Federation of Colored Women 2 years ago, and they persuaded her to come back where she could do art and advocate for some of her causes. So here's a few ads for her business. The Popular Studio has reopened for scholars and the public. She offers both art commissions and lessons in several different media. And these appear over and over and over again in the paper. So it's interesting to note, we talk about her advocacy, we talk about her artwork, but I think also she was a very successful businesswoman, very practically smart. To make a living as an artist, it's always been hard. She did it. Okay, so this is one of my favorite little connections here. So this is the National Association of Colored Women again. She's using her artistic talents to lend to exhibitions for conventions. Again, not something you would necessarily think. You go to a convention, you're going to hear speeches, there might be some activities, there might be some social events. There are art exhibits going on here, and this article makes a great statement about art and its role in activism. Okay, so this is Mrs. Sloan Yates, who's the president at the time, and I've kind of brought it up here. So it says, the gathering of the national body has been an inspiration and a revelation as to the work and development of Afro-American women, not only with references to discussions, but also because of the more tangible proofs of their development through the exhibits of paintings, literature, and music collected mainly through the activity of Miss Lottie Wilson, who has a studio in this city, which is Washington, D.C. So tangible proofs is what she's offering. I just really like that. So, as we mentioned, her work is going to lead her to other cities across the country, perhaps even abroad, Bay City, Indianapolis, Washington, D.C., but she returned to Niles often and considered it home. She moved back permanently to Niles in 1905. There's a little notice in her paper after the death of her mother. She's going to remarry again to Daniel Moss, and she continues to exhibit her work and hold classes at her family home on the corner of 5th and Ferry Streets, still standing today. It's worth noting that that home and the Ferry Street area with its church, which was Second Baptist Church, today it's Mount Calvary Church, the school, which tragically burned in 2023, and the Prince Hall Masons Lodge served as a hub for Niles' African American community. Franklin AME Church is just a few blocks over. She also considered her advocacy in Niles, serving as president and representative to Detroit of the local auxiliary to the National Association of Colored Women. And then on the right is just a fun little article about her hosting a marshmallow roast with her husband at their farm they called Mossdale. So Lottie died on January 16th, 1914, and she's buried at Silverbrook Cemetery along with her children, which we talked about before, and her parents. We had this green historical sign in the cemetery. This was added just a few years ago to talk about her a little bit. Her legacy lives on. She still has relatives here, as we mentioned. The Finley family, and there's some hills too, although I think there are fewer hills in the area now. The Finley family was recognized in 2017 as being the oldest African-American family continuously living in Niles, and they claim her as a relation with good cause. Here's a notice in the paper about a party given by Mrs. G.P. Finley, who's Melissa Hill Finley, and Melissa was Lottie's great aunt. Alice Finley Brown and her daughter, Pat Gresham, both deceased now, sadly, deserve much of the credit for keeping Lottie's memory alive. And as I mentioned, it's Alice's research that brought that painting home. So she was also inducted into the Michigan Women's Hall of Fame, which is now called Michigan Women Forward. And she's been recognized posthumously by the Daughters of the American Revolution, received a special tribute from the state of Michigan, and she's getting a bit more recognition in academic study. So I hope this continues. I hope more of her work comes to light, and also mostly that her story is told and continues to inspire all of us. And I'll just kind of end. I'm going to see if I can click on the link here and pull up her listing in the Hall of Fame. See if it goes there. There she is. So she got in on the first try, partly because Molly wrote an excellent nomination, but that's very unusual is what they said. Like people like Diana Ross are in the Michigan Women's Hall of Fame. They get in on the first try, and she got in on the first try, as she deserved. So that's all I have, but if there's any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Yes, Barb.
You showed the miniature of her daughter.
Yes.
And did you say that the daughter died when she was 10?
She was 10, yeah.
Doesn't that miniature look like a much older?
So this is the painting in the middle. And the miniature, it's hard to kind of zoom in on, but it looks like the painting to me.
But
so
it's just the clothing and the hair and the face.
Okay, so let me be clear. So the lady is Lottie. This is Lottie. Yes, the woman is Lottie. The tiny miniature is Caletta. So yes, yeah, this is her. Don't know where this painting came from, if it's a self-portrait or if somebody did this of her, but the little tiny miniature is Callie.
Now another question.
Yes.
Since you have an original here, I think you might want to explore to contact an art, I can't think of the word I want, someone who specializes in identifying, or you have an original, then you have questions about all these others. That person maybe not definitely, but could eliminate the ones that are definitely not hers, which might be closer to finding some, and then blasting it out, that's what you're looking for.
Yep, so we're doing that a little bit. So some of the people that I mentioned, a couple of kind of trails. So we are trying to, so we've contacted the Chicago School of the Art Institute to see, because they had it on their website, first graduate, and it's down now. It was like an anniversary celebration, like can we see your source? Like, tell us about her. We want to know everything about Lottie. We haven't heard back from them yet. We're also talking to, we're going to look through the Chicago History Museum and some of see if we can trace more, because they have papers and information from the Lincoln Jubilee, which I'd love to see, and see if there's any notes about art. And the National Portrait Gallery too. We filled out the form, we're waiting. So I've done it, like I did it, Rhonda Spencer's done it, because I feel like that looks like it could potentially be her work. And she was known, here he is, to work from photographs. This would have been obviously a photograph because it's him as a young man, and she would have known him as an older gentleman. But yeah, absolutely. So we're trying to do that. She is getting more. We had, the painting was on loan to a museum in Pennsylvania, right? Brandywine Art Museum. So she is getting a bit more recognition in the art world, and I have to believe some of these miniatures that were created, there's got to be some around. You know, they were copyrighted and sold, you know, and there was a demand, and you know, how many, you know, it's not a factory, but did she make a dozen? Did she make 2 dozen? Yes, Suzanne.
I told you this before, but when I worked at the Bentley Library in the 70s, they have a very small Sojourner Truth collection. And in that collection, there's a cabinet photo, which was of Lincoln and Sojourner Truth, and it's the same pose. And on the back, Lincoln has inscribed it for anti-Sojourner Truth and signed it. So she may have worked from a cabinet photo and not from that other guy's painting. He may have worked from the cabinet photo too. Obviously, you know, the people weren't still alive at that point, but you know, I'd love to make the connection between the cabinet photo and her painting.
Yeah, that would be cool. Yes?
Do we know what happened to Daniel Moss?
Yeah, he remarries, and he lived for quite a few more years, at least 10 years beyond Lottie. So yeah, he stayed in Niles, remarried, and I want to say he died in the 20s?
20s,
yeah.
That's why I was wondering, is because the lady said it was 1928 when but there was a connection between Mrs. Nelson and Daniel.
Yeah, there is. The farm was Howard Township, or was it north? Was it more?
Is it like Pucker Street?
I think it's more out that way, like where like the Singer farms are and stuff. So we just caught that name, and then I started going down so many rabbit holes with this, and I just caught that Mossdale farm note, and I've been looking up Mossdale. I did a newspaper search for that now, and I found a few more sites of it. So we're starting to trace that one too, and just see anything she did is interesting. She had a marshmallow roast. Like, how fun is that? You know, how great would that be? So, and I'm like, you know, there's guests mentioned from Chicago, important visitors. So,
I know I had some stuff mentioned.
yes.
So her house is over on 5th Street still?
5th and Ferry.
It's that
Yep.
gray one? That's right.
It's that bluish gray one. Yep. It's not in fantastic shape anymore, but it's privately owned.
Just by people, no?
Yeah, people, I know somebody who went and put flowers on it or wanted to plant flowers nearby a few years ago, and that was not taken too kindly. I mean, you know, you can imagine that you don't necessarily want people showing up in your yard and planting flowers, you know, but I said, yeah. They wanted to have me go and make a case for it. I was like, well, I can't, you really shouldn't go plant flowers in your yard, so it's neat, but.
Their own name, but when she died, Daniel Moss inherited it.
Yes, I believe that's true too, because it was her family home and then it went to him because she had no children. So Mary Ellen's the legal scholar. She's gotten the wills and all that stuff for us. So. All right. Okay, well, thank you for being here, and hope you enjoy the exhibit. And like I said, the paintings on the other side, we've done a couple of additional panels here to talk about those connections, but then there's kind of everything else that you can see too. All right. We're done.